Hello and welcome to this screencast on skill acquisition, specifically stages of learning. Okay, so some of you may have looked at this at GCSE level. So if you're talking about GCSE terminology here, you learn about low ability stages of learning, as in your ability within a skill, and you learn about high ability. Now, this is the case as well with A level P, but we use this knowledge from this GCSE now, and we are going to transfer it more to A level because we need to look at ability now as a continuum in terms of if we're talking about low ability, what is it specifically we are talking about in terms of the stage of learning that we're at? Okay, so we need to now know that we have different stages of learning. Okay, so we have low ability, and then we have a stage of learning which kind of identifies why we have low ability. Then we have a middle stage of learning, and finally we also have a kind of like a third stage, which is when we are or have high ability within that skill. So the stages of learning we need to be aware of are the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. So if we're looking towards the left hand side of this continuum here, the cognitive stage, so this low ability stage, but what you need to know, stages of learning, this is the first stage of learning that we come across is a cognitive stage, and this is the early stage of learning where skill learning goals are set and learning takes place. Okay, I'm going to use an example we'll all be aware of when it comes to stages of learning, but then we're going to have to give a sporting example as well, which we're going to go through. So you've also got the associative stage, which is this stage is typically the longest and is where the performer gets more successful. So you start the cognitive stage, that's the early stage of learning where you start to learn the new skill. Then you have the associative stage where you begin to become more successful. And then finally, we have this autonomous stage, which is the final stage of the learning process, which is when you are fluent at the skill. And as it says there, some people won't ever reach that. You don't necessarily need to get that information down. It's just visually there for you to see kind of what we mean by stage one, the cognitive stage two of learning, the associative stage, and then the autonomous stage of learning. So if I'm going to give you an example that's not sporting that we can all relate to here, it's riding a bike. So if you think about it, when you first start to ride a bike, you have no fluency whatsoever. You are all over the place. You fall off. You're not confident when it comes to pedaling and then also kind of navigating around the streets. This is the cognitive stage of learning. You are not fluent. You've only just started school. You're probably using stabilizers. And then you get a bit better at it. So now you start to get into the associative stage. You start to become slightly more fluent at cycling a bike, and you might actually take the stabilizers off, and you do become more successful. But you're still not at that autonomous stage just yet. Okay, now let's come to your age right now. For the majority of you, riding a bike now, I imagine you are probably at the autonomous stage where you are completely fluent. You're making decisions before before you turn right, for example. You know exactly how you're going to take the corner to turn right. You're completely fluent in the action, and you feel confident with cycling. So that is how the stages of learning would work with cycling. Now we need to use sporting examples for each stage, and I'm just going to give you a quick one now with basketball. Okay, so in the cognitive stage of learning, the basketball dribble will probably be overhead height and out of control. You're probably going to be double dribbling or doing some double dribbling where you're bouncing it, it's going really high, then you're catching it, then you're bouncing it again. And you're going to be at that cognitive stage, that early stage of learning, and you're not going to be very fluent at the skill. Then at the associative stage, after a bit of practice, you're going to start to be able to dribble. You're probably dribbling now at chest height, and your control has improved. So you're maybe not double dribbling now. You're able to bounce it, and you realise that you can't catch it and bounce again. And your bouncing of the ball has got a bit more controlled at chest height. And finally, at the autonomous stage of learning, you are able to dribble that basketball at waist height whilst looking for your next pass. You're probably changing hands with your bounce, so you're not just using your right or your left hand, you're switching between the hands and so on. So this is just a really short bit of the stages of learning. We've got the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. They're the three stages of learning that we need to be aware of. Our first focus for today, okay, is going to be describing and memorizing characteristics of the stages of learning. So those stages, the cognitive stage, the autonomous stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage, they have characteristics within them that we must know. We must know these characteristics. And not only that, this is really important when it comes to skill acquisition, that every single characteristic we mention in each of the stages, we need to be able to use a sporting example. So we need to be able to describe the characteristics of the stages of learning using a sporting example. I'm going to go through that, this next one, with this kind of like focus. This focus we're looking at is the importance of feedback and fluency when describing stages of learning. Feedback and fluency is going to be really important for us because we can discuss feedback and fluency for every single stage as a characteristic. So when we talk about the characteristics of the stages of learning, we can speak about feedback and fluency in the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. That is really important. So, as I said, feedback and fluency are able to be spoken about in every single one. So it's really key that we're able to describe the characteristics of each stage by using feedback and fluency. So first of all, we're going to look at fluency. If you're looking at fluency, this is how well a skill flows or links together. Okay, so you can see, I think I showed you the video of Roger Federer last lesson. That was pure fluency when playing his tennis strokes and his tennis shots. So if we're talking about fluency at each stage, I'm sure you're going to understand now which level of fluency we're going to be at for each stage. So for example, the cognitive stage, fluency, we're going to have low levels. So we're going to have low levels of fluency at the cognitive stage. So if you're asked to describe a characteristic of the cognitive stage of learning, feedback, fluency, you've got to remember, and we just remember low levels of fluency for the cognitive stage, then we're in. If we think fluency, we're in, because if we think of the associative stage, that's when we get a bit better. So we become more improved in the associative stage. So fluency goes from having low levels to improved levels of fluency. So with that stem of just low levels, we've remembered fluency now. We're going to be able to characterize each stage using the term fluency. Low levels of fluency in the cognitive stage, improved levels of fluency in the associative stage. We're getting better. We're still not great, but we're getting better. And you've guessed it, the autonomous stage, we're going to have high levels of fluency. So, as you've noticed, by using one word, just fluency, we are able to describe the 3 stages of learning in terms of characteristics. We're able to do the same for feedback as well. So if we're talking about feedback now, it's really important we know the difference between extrinsic feedback and intrinsic feedback. This is feedback whilst doing the skill. So for example, extrinsic feedback is anything external, i.e. from the coach. So the coach is going to have to give you feedback to learn. Okay, for extrinsic. And intrinsic is feedback that's internal. It comes from within, the feel of it. You know when something feels right. If you've kind of had a shot in netball, you know what that's going in before it's even left your hand. Or if you've had a shot in football, it's the same. It just feels right. That is intrinsic feedback. So if we're talking now or thinking about the stages of learning, I'm hoping that you'd understand the cognitive stage of learning. The feedback that we're going to be relying upon is going to be extrinsic feedback. Okay, so extrinsic feedback is relied upon during the cognitive stage of learning. We don't know what a skill feels like at that stage. We don't know what feels right, what feels good. It's a new skill to us. We need someone to tell us. We need a coach to say, okay, you need to spread your fingers apart on the basketball while you're bouncing it, or you're bouncing it too hard. Kind of lessen the force when you're bouncing the ball. You need that extrinsic feedback during the cognitive stage. So when we start to get a bit better at the skill, so we go into the associative stage of learning, we almost become we start to use intrinsic feedback. Okay, so starting to use it is really important. So now we've gone from relying on extrinsic feedback to we are able to feel the skill and think, you know what, actually just doesn't feel quite right. I think I can do this a bit better. So you start to rely on your intrinsic feedback, that feel, that internal relationship you have with the skill. And then finally, for the autonomous stage, we solely use intrinsic feedback to detect and correct errors. So now using basketball as an example, I am bouncing a basketball. I absolutely need no feedback from a coach. I know exactly how this skill feels. I know if I'm doing it correctly or not. So I might just take one forceful bounce and straight away I detect my error, or I detect what I've done and I quickly correct it and be like, no, okay, I need to kind of bounce with less force. So you use completely intrinsic feedback. You do not rely upon extrinsic feedback during the autonomous stage. Now, as I said on this slide, the importance of feedback and fluency. What is really important, and we're going to do it now for each stage, is we need to be able to give an example for each characteristic. So for low levels of fluency, we need a sporting example. For feedback, we need a sporting example, and we may need more characteristics from each stage of learning as well. However, fluency and feedback is really important because it can be used in each of the 3 stages of learning. We're going to have to add more now. So this second focus that we're looking on is applying additional characteristics, have I said. So far we've got fluency and feedback, works in all 3 stages of learning. However, we do need additional characteristics that are different for each stage. And also, we need to provide sporting examples to the stages of learning. Sporting examples for every characteristic. Not a sporting example just for the cognitive stage and a sporting example just for the associative stage. We need a sporting example for the cognitive stage, for fluency, sporting example, feedback, sporting example. The next characteristic we're going to go on to next slide, sporting example. Next characteristic, sporting example. You must have a sporting example for every characteristic, not just for the one stage as a whole. That's really important. So let's get on to it. I'm going to give you the sporting examples for each stage of learning at this kind of time as we are doing these lessons. It's really important that you understand and have concrete examples for each characteristic. However, later on in the skill acquisition process, the later we go in lessons, the more lessons we do and you become more confident, I don't mind you then using your own personal examples from your own sport. However, at this stage right now, we are going to use the examples that I give you for each of the sporting characteristics. So, first of all, we are going to talk about the cognitive stage of learning. Now, it's really important that we answer this by saying the performer uses or the performer will experience. So if we're talking about characteristics, the stages of learning, we already know that the cognitive stage, the performer experiences low levels of fluency. We've already got this from the last slide. This is going to be really key for your core notes. These next characteristics, all of these slides from now on are going to be really important. You've got questions and answers for each one. So the cognitive stage of learning, or the cognitive stage of learning, yes, the performer is going to experience low levels of fluency. For example, basketball dribble above head height with no control. The performer isn't fluid. Okay, so they're not going to be able to control the basketball dribble. So low levels of fluency, for example, a basketball dribble above head height with no control. We also know that they're going to rely upon extrinsic feedback. So the performer is going to rely upon extrinsic feedback, and a sporting example would be a coach telling the performer how to dribble. So we know about the cognitive stage of learning as the first stage of learning when we first pick up a new skill. We know the characteristics are low levels of fluency and extrinsic feedback being relied upon. We also need to know that characteristics of the cognitive stage of learning is the performer has to create a mental picture of the skill that they're doing. For example, watching the coach dribble. So at this stage, when you are new to a skill and you're not very fluent in it and you're using extrinsic feedback relied upon, i.e. the coach showing you how to dribble, once the coach has shown you, you have to create that mental picture of the coach dribbling. During the skill, you will then rely upon trial and error. You will get mistakes. You will make mistakes in the cognitive stage of learning, but you learn from those mistakes, don't you? Okay, everyone says you've got to learn from mistakes. Trial and error. In the cognitive stage, it's all about trial and error, e.g. making mistakes when dribbling. Have you noticed how, as I've said, there's an example for each characteristic? This is key for the skill acquisition paper too. You've got to have an example for each characteristic. And then finally, there are low levels of consistency. When we're talking about consistency, we are saying you're not able to repeat the skill confidently, constantly over a period of time. So your ability to repeat the skill is low. So there's low levels of consistency. For example, there are more unsuccessful dribbles than there are successful dribbles. So that is the cognitive stage of learning. They are your characteristics. You've got the 3 new characteristics: mental picture, trial and error, low levels of consistency, and you've got your sporting examples for each characteristic. So now we're going to move on to the associative stage of learning. So if we're talking about the associative stage of learning, the performer will use or experience improved levels of fluency. For example, we're now dribbling the ball at chest height. We are starting to use intrinsic feedback now. Okay, so for example, the player can start to adjust to height of the dribble. So now you as the performer can think, you know what, I'm bouncing this a bit high. I can feel that. I can change this myself. You start to use intrinsic feedback. We are now beginning to have improved levels of consistency. In the cognitive stage, we've got low levels. However, the associative stage, this next stage, we've got improved levels of consistency. For example, now we have the equal number of unsuccessful and successful dribbles. We're becoming slightly more consistent. At this stage, we can now make a link between the mental picture and performance. For example, a player can start to perform the dribble from their head. They don't necessarily need that mental picture of the coach dribbling. They can do it from their own head. And then finally, we're at the practice stage as well. During the associative stage, for example, the player spends time practicing the dribble. You are now on your own consistently practicing that dribble. You are getting improved consistency from that. And we are in this associative stage where we have improved levels of fluency. Finally, the third and final stage, the autonomous stage of learning. We now know the performer uses high levels of fluency during the autonomous stage of learning. For example, a basketball dribbler at waist height is now under complete control. We know that we use intrinsic feedback to detect and correct errors. For example, the player can adjust to the height of the dribble themselves. We have high consistency, so majority of dribbles are now successful, as opposed to when it went to the cognitive stage, we had low levels of consistency. Now at the autonomous stage, we have this high consistency level. The majority of our dribbles are now successful. We can start to focus on tactics and strategies as opposed to just the skills that we are performing. For example, a player can dribble whilst thinking of the next pass or the next play or their next decision, their next move. Hopefully you've got good notes on that. Please ensure you have questions for every single point, and as I've said, it is really important that you have an example for each characteristic available. Okay, thank you for that. I'll see you in lesson. Bye.